One of the most distinctive voices on the climate change debate is that of Bjorn Lomborg. Skeptics and so-called lukewarmers love him, climate campaigners are reduced to puddles of fury by him. In his latest book, False Alarm, Lomborg repeats what has long been his most distinctive argument, that the climate change policies put forward today are incredibly bad value, spending $1 for just 11 cents worth of climate benefit. He argues that although climate change is a problem that should be addressed, the projected economic scenarios show our optimum response does not involve net zero by 2050 or anything like it. Well, is he right? Let's take a look. Let's start off by giving the core case that Bjorn Lomborg makes. Then we'll look at the evidence base that he draws from to support it. And then we'll look at what critics of the idea say and whether they stand up to scrutiny. When it comes to the economics of climate change, Lomborg draws heavily from Professor William Nordhaus, the only climate economist to be awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2018. And that seems a pretty good call to authority. Although, as you know, we don't do calls to authority on this channel, we look at the arguments and the evidence. What does Nordhaus do? He collates scientific evidence on the impacts of climate change, such as on agriculture, energy and forestry, as well as on sea level rises. That is then input into economic models, which are then used to estimate the costs of climate change. Reviewing the outcome of this leads Lomborg to his central contention, which is this. When we look at the full range of studies addressing this issue, what we find is that the cost of climate change is significant but moderate in terms of overall global GDP. Remember, of course, that the world will be getting much richer over the course of the century, and that will still be true with climate change. We will still be much richer, but slightly less so than we would have been without global warming. Accounting for these additional costs, a temperature increase of 7.2 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 4 degrees Celsius, around the end of the century would mean a reduction in global GDP of about 4%, as compared to the 2.9% reduction projected without the additional costs. He does add this qualifier. It is obvious that predicting a cost centuries into the future with exactitude is impossible. What is most important is that while the cost may end up at 3.5, 4.0 or 4.5% in 2100, it's unlikely to be 0.01% or 45% of GDP. He then contrasts this with what he says will be the huge costs of net zero by 2050 policies or otherwise policies inspired by the Paris Agreement on climate change. Climate policies also have costs that often vastly outweigh their climate benefits. The Paris Agreement, if fully implemented, will cost $819 to $1,890 billion per year in 2030, yet will reduce emissions by just 1% of what is needed to limit average global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Each dollar spent on Paris will likely produce climate benefits worth 11 cents. He then goes on to his ideal scenario. Using carbon taxes, an optimal, realistic climate policy can aggressively reduce emissions and reduce the global temperature increase from 4.1 degrees C in 2100 to 3.75 degrees C. This will cost $18 trillion, but deliver climate benefits worth twice that. The popular 2 degrees C target, in contrast, is unrealistic and would leave the world more than $250 trillion worse off. The most effective climate policy is increasing investment in green R&D to make future decarbonisation much cheaper. This can deliver $11 of climate benefits for each dollar spent. More effective climate policies can help the world do better. The current climate discourse leads to wasteful climate policies, diverting attention and funds from more effective ways to improve the world. Now, before we dive into the supporting evidence for these arguments and all the cut and thrust, let me say a couple of things just in terms of points of principle. The reason why I wanted to look at this case in a video like this is because there's clearly a discussion to be had about the real benefits and costs of proposed policies on climate change. The debate has been so hijacked by the view that every news story has to reinforce the message that climate change is important and we need to take significant action, etc., etc. The basic oversight and questioning that we expect a proposed policy seems more often to be evidenced by its absence. There may be half a dozen ways and timescales that may be possible for decarbonising the economy, but even suppose there are just two. There still needs to be serious scrutiny with an open mind to determine which one of the two is better. Is this specific policy proposal sensible? Will it even work? Does it provide a reliable, high-quality alternative to the present? How much does it cost? And even if you have to anticipate that the cost will come down, when they have, does it provide good value for money? Those and dozens of other questions are all ripe to be asked, and I like the fact that Lomborg challenges a status quo that is not scrutinising such questions very closely at all. Now, whether it's doing us a favour that he's the one doing it depends on the quality of his work. After all, Al Gore was a principal advocate on climate change in the US, and it mostly had the effect of polarising US politics on the issue. Lomborg similarly polarises, but the question is whether that's because they don't like his message, even though he has a good point, in which case, too bad, or whether because he's got his facts wrong and has reduced the credibility for the case by the way that he makes it. And of course, some people will allege that, whether it's true or not, so we have to look with an open mind and with some degree of care. My second comment on principle is that I start off being somewhat amused that some of the climate change skeptics who will tell you that climate models are junk are nevertheless huge fans of Bjorn Lomborg with his work that's based on economic models. Climate models at least are based on known properties and the laws of physics. I mean, they're a long way from perfect, but at least what they're measuring is run past some pretty solidly based rules. Economic models are trying to model aggregate human behaviour. That's a lot harder because people respond differently to stimuli depending on context. And I'm particularly sceptical of an economic model predictions of GDP in 100 years' time. It presupposes so many different variables that depend on historical events. I mean, if we go back in time 100 years and think we could run an economic model that would predict where we are now, they would have to predict so many things, world wars, policies for economic deregulation, and so on, things that could never have been anticipated. However, let's be very clear about the core case here, and it's this. The idea that global development scenarios, how we manage economically and socially, have greater differences to the beneficial outcomes or otherwise than does climate policy alone. Or as Mike Hume put it in his 2020 paper, there are some futures beyond 1.5 degrees centigrade or even 2 degrees centigrade that are more desirable than other futures which do not exceed these warming thresholds. We should not mistake one set for the other. Maybe there's an optimum response where we benefit the economy most whilst meeting the 2 degrees C target, but there are certainly lots of scenarios where we implement bad policies, wreck the economy, spread global poverty, and while hitting the 2 degrees C target, create nevertheless much more global human suffering, versus a scenario where we created wealth in a more optimal way. Don't underestimate, that's not just going to fall in your lap, by the way, whilst attaining 2.2 or 2.5 degrees C, whatever. And this is an important call for clear thinking and analysis, and that's why I think Lomborg's voice has been a genuine contributor to the discussion. Whether he's right in the detail of how he's doing it is another matter, but we should be asking these questions. Not many people are doing it. By the way, supplementary to looking at the detail of the core point, Lomborg also raises a number of other general good points in his book. One of which is that many of the scenarios that people paint about the future routinely do not factor in adaptation. So predictions about how many people will be displaced by sea level rise or whatever. But of course, many locations can adapt with various forms of sea defences and so on. So you shouldn't just assume communities worldwide watch helplessly as the water laps around their ankles. You don't want to engage in magical thinking on adaptation. Silver bullet, a get out of jail free card. But it's a fair point to observe that the genuinely alarmist predictions include no such assumptions so that they max up the starkness of their impact. Alright, let's look at this. Lomborg, as I said, is drawing from the work of Professor William Nordhaus. He devised the groundbreaking dynamic integrated model of climate and the economy, known as the DICE model. It's this model that produces estimates of the costs of action and inaction on climate change, and which Lomborg draws heavily from. So, where Lomborg says that a temperature increase of 4 degrees C around the end of the century would mean a reduction in global GDP of around 4%, 3.64% more precisely, that claim refers to Nordhaus's 2018 paper. It's worth noting what Nordhaus himself says in that paper, as he's introducing the results from the DICE 2016 R2 model that Lomborg uses. As a final point, I emphasise that many uncertainties remain. Analysts do not know and are unlikely soon to know how the global economy or energy technologies will evolve, or what the exact response of geophysical systems will be to evolving economic conditions, or exactly how damaging climate change will be for the economy as well as non-market and non-human systems. We also do not know with precision how to represent the different systems in our economic and scientific models. The bottom line here is that this most recent stocktaking has more bad news than good news, and that the need for policies to slow climate change is more pressing and not less pressing. I note that because that's not the conclusion that Lomborg reaches. Using Nordhaus's figures, he argues the exact opposite. So maybe he's right and Nordhaus is wrong, but you'd need to give a pretty good solid argument as to why that's the case. Key to Lomborg's argument is that the proposed policies cost a lot more than the benefit they bring. So, drawing from this graph from the International Energy Agency World Energy Report 2018, Lomborg argues that globally in 2020, taxpayers will pay $141 billion to subsidise inefficient solar and wind energy. No, that's a bit of a loaded statement. The language that people use tells you whether they're relating facts or whether they're seeking to manipulate how you feel about those facts. Throwing in taxpayers will pay and inefficient solar and wind, a bit of a flag for me because, the writer's obviously seeking to load on values judgments, not just facts. What he misses out in saying is that the IEA actually says at that point in the report, the average support per unit of electricity generated by renewables declines dramatically in most regions to 2040, largely as a result of technology cost reductions and rising wholesale electricity prices. By 2040, the global average support per unit of output for new solar PV projects declines almost 90%. And for new wind power projects, it declines by almost 70%. And the question to some degree is this. If renewable energy, because nuclear isn't mentioned, is going to increase with subsidies, particularly in the early stages, what is it replacing? In the same IEA report, it also notes that the current existence of inefficient subsidies for fossil fuels. We estimate that artificially low prices for fossil fuels for end users around the world involved subsidies totaling just over $300 billion in 2017. This is lower than in 2015, thanks in part to pricing reforms in many countries, but these reforms are coming under pressure as oil prices rise. Now, I've seen other estimates, quoted more often by environmentalists, such as from a 2019 IMF estimate that said that fossil fuel subsidies were $5.2 trillion, equivalent to 6.5% of global GDP in 2017. I'm very wary of those because they get rather creative about building in the claimed costs of deaths and illnesses from local air pollution and things like that. I'm not convinced that's immensely helpful. That discussion could be a video all of its own, to be fair. But it's enough to just note this. Having followed Lomborg's claim to its source, I would just note that if you're calculating the cost of climate policies, specifically early subsidy for renewables, then you should rationally weigh these against any existing subsidies that would be displaced with the old energy forms. I mean, that's the policy equivalent of factoring in adaptation if you're looking at the costs of climate change, right? Don't see that you can argue one and then ignore the other. Lomborg also decides to cost climate policies by taking the cost calculations that Nordhaus produces and then doubling them. And he rationalises it like this. Politicians often pick ineffective climate policies. The European Union has seen its climate change policy cost double from the most effective level it could have been because politicians didn't make the most efficient choices and couldn't help but dish out favours to some industries over others. Similarly, much climate policy in many US states, including New York, California and Hawaii, is based on the Renewable Portfolio Standard, a regulation that, according to economists, makes it at least twice as expensive as the most efficient policy would have been. That's quite a damning claim. It references this paper, which says, "We find that, in most cases, renewable portfolio standards are approximately twice as costly as the equivalent least cost portfolio for achieving CO2 reductions." But if you actually read the paper, That applies to the early stages of reducing CO2, where the cheapest option is to switch from coal to natural gas. As you get into deeper emissions cuts, and then you need to move away from fossil fuels entirely, then the lines converge. So the paper doesn't support the implications that Lomborg presents, that, politicians just blunder around making terrible choices, and that equals twice the cost. I mean, my natural prejudices, probably like yours, against the political classes would easily get me believing such a stat. And nobody should ever argue that we should expect politicians to follow the optimum policies. But if you're going to claim that such inefficiency adds twice the cost, you have to be fairly robust about the historical basis for that claim. The upshot of all of this is that Lomborg's high estimated cost of climate change and relatively low estimated cost of the impact of climate change lead him to calculate the optimum level of global warming by the end of the century as being 3.75 degrees Celsius. That's the area where the cost of climate action provides real benefit as opposed to excessive cost. So that's Lomborg's argument. That's the research base behind it, which, if it doesn't perfectly support him, but we've explored what the key questions are. What are the criticisms to this argument? Do they hold weight? One of the most substantive is one that suggests his calculation has been made completely out of date by a 2020 study that highlights that the default settings of the DICE 2016 R2 Nordhaus model have outdated assumptions about the science and the economics of climate change. This paper by Hansel et al. Suggested that if the calibration for the models updated with recent data, then the optimum climate policy paths become consistent with the 2 degrees C target. But others have attacked the model in any case for assumptions that it makes in relation to what the cost of climate change will be to the economy. And it turns out there is a massive assumption that lurks under the hood of this model. It was expressed succinctly like this. Economic activities such as agriculture, forestry, fisheries and mining are exposed to the weather and thus vulnerable to climate change. Other economic activities such as manufacturing and services largely take place in controlled environments and are not really exposed to climate change. That is a massive assumption and frankly bizarre. It arbitrarily excludes almost 90% of GDP from any potential damage from climate change because it happens indoors. Well, it's hardly surprising that the economic costs of climate change always turn out to be on the remarkably low side if you build that assumption into your model. The businesses that operated in the region of Germany and Belgium that just got massively flooded out, be interesting to know what opinion they have about whether they had been insulated against the impact of the weather. And mentioning that isn't to make arguments about whether that single event was specifically related to human-caused climate change or any of that, just making the obvious point that all sorts of businesses can be and have been disrupted by climatic events, making the bland assumption to the contrary, it's an unsafe assumption. So that raises a question mark over the whole basis for the exercise. But then physicist Ken Rice also pointed out another anomaly in Lomborg's position relating to costs versus benefits. What's more, he said, if you look at William Nordhaus's recent paper, you find that the damage as a fraction of output is indeed around 4% for the reference scenario, but with a range from close to 0 to about 12%. So it has a non-negligible chance of being quite large enough to be reasonably described as moderate. So even with those questionable assumptions behind them, the Nordhaus model could allow for significantly higher cost damage. But then he goes on. Lomborg's paper goes on to say the popular 2 degrees C target in contrast is unrealistic and would leave the world more than $250 trillion worse off. However, if you scroll down the paper, you discover that this devastating and unrealistic policy would cost 5.4% of future global GDP. So the economic impact of 4 degrees C of warming would be moderate at 4%, but potentially more than 10% of global GDP. But trying to limit warming to 2 degrees C would be devastating at 5.4% of global GDP. And that's a rather telling argument, isn't it? Figures and consequences are not being presented neutrally. They're being given different labels, different spins according to Lomborg's preference. Now, Ken Rice makes one more point, which is that Lomborg's reference scenario is one that takes us to a 4 degrees C world. So to diverge from that path to meet only 2 degrees C is going to be highly expensive. But he points out that there are strong indications with the current data that our existing policy is taking us to a 3 degrees C world. So Lomborg's version makes it seem more difficult and more expensive to limit warming to 2 degrees C than might actually be the case in the real world. Now it's worth returning to Nordhaus in all of this, because you might conclude that Lomborg has used his work, slightly twisted it by doubling the cost inputs apparently to get the result that he wanted. After all the debate and discussion, where does Nordhaus fall? First, in response to the skeptics seeking to use his work to justify the argument you should delay taking action, he pushed back and said that wasn't consistent with his work. Writing in the New York Books Review, he said this: "Waiting is not only economically costly, but will also make the transition much more costly when it eventually takes place." Now, that doesn't mean he necessarily falls in with the net zero targets. In an interview this year, he said this: "We have set the bar for our aspirations so high. Aiming for net zero carbon emissions by the middle of the century is a very ambitious target. In my own mind, there is a twin set of policies. One is carbon pricing and one is strong support for low carbon technologies. Both are necessary if we're going to reach our goals. I think it's a worthy goal, but it is largely aspirational and not practical. All the economic modelling up to now says it's on the outer edge of the possible. With a high and rising carbon price, you might get to zero by mid-century, or maybe not. Half a model say you can, half a model say you can't. But it would require extremely high carbon prices, in the hundreds of dollars per tonne, with virtually every country participating and cooperating, and that's not the world I know." So, where does this leave us? I remain unconvinced about claims with the air of certainty about what the economic impact of climate change will be. You need to make many assumptions about what damage does or doesn't take place, and as we've seen with the recent heat dome and the extraordinary European floods, such things, the severity of them can be hard to anticipate. Those events were not predicted by climate models. They may never happen again, or they may become regular occurrences, and if we don't know that, we shouldn't pretend to know the economic impact that another degree of warming is going to have. Lomborg's principal source, Nordhaus, acknowledges this. In A Question of Balance, he said the models used have a limited ability in dealing with catastrophic events and tipping points, at which damage functions turn up sharply and damages become infinite, which might justify trillions of dollars of abatement costs. When it comes to risk, what you don't know should be treated as higher risk, not lower risk. But then, that applies as well to the unintended consequences and the unnecessary costs of public policies. Bjorn Lomborg makes a significant contribution to the debate when he calls on us to look at the total development paths for human society, not just the climate part in isolation. And I've seen this in the same way that I've seen the pandemic lockdowns. Decision makers have been focusing on just one variable, COVID-19 infections and deaths, and not the whole picture of overall human well-being. Now, if they'd done that, they might still have chosen to do lockdowns. I mean, who knows? But in the absence of any attempt to run the numbers on both sides of the balance sheet, you follow one variable policy, keep your fingers crossed that the inevitable downside of your choices won't turn out to be worse than the thing that you were fighting. And so it is here. Climate policies should be asked hard questions. The ways that we alleviate poverty in developing countries, how such people get reliable energy, those do need to be factored into the equation. There's no point following extreme climate policies on the grounds that if you don't, millions will die, and in so doing exacerbating poverty, resulting in tens of millions or hundreds of millions of people dying. So in short, we have to at least be capable of asking the question whether a rich world with free sea of warming may prove more resilient to natural disasters than a poor world of 1 degree C warming. So we have to run the numbers. But my instinct is that having looked at all of this, we have to run those numbers a lot more carefully than Lomborg's doing, with a high degree of rigour. I don't think the outcome of this supports that you don't bother moving towards zero carbon energy early. I do think you can ask hard and searching questions about trade-offs that come with it. And we have an interest in identifying the most efficient and the lowest cost measures, not least because those are the ones that are likely to be politically most feasible. I'm frustrated with Bjorn Lomborg. He's contributed an important element into the debate. He's chosen to play to one side, to play the role of the contrarian, therefore to exaggerate the numbers, to maximise it. And that's been great marketing for him. He's highly in demand with a certain community. But it's preventing those hard questions being taken seriously elsewhere, where they actually deserve to be. Unlike some others, though, I'm not going to dismiss him and count him as someone who is only ever to be waved away, dismissed out of hand. His answers to his own questions may be flawed at the moment, but the questions he's asking are important. In a grown-up world, they should be questions that we're discussing. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.